This video is an upgraded and revised version of my Richmond to Perth by train in 1965. It is one of my first YouTube videos and is a bit rough. I got some good feedback but also received some quite negative reactions, especially in regard to the music I used. This version hopefully corrects these problems. It now has actual specific train sounds taken from my archives as well as more appropriate music. Once again, it is a record of my first trip home from Sydney on annual leave by train to Perth. The standard gauge line has not yet been built, so it actually took 8 trains to travel from the Richmond Air Force Base to my home in Oak Street in Western Australia. Note that not all the footage was taken in 1965. Quite a bit of the other railway action was filmed up till about 1970. I spent most of my time at the Richmond Royal Australian Air Force Base in New South Wales, about 65 kilometres west of Sydney, located at the foot of the Blue Mountains. I joined the Air Force in April 1965 at the age of 17, and after receiving initial training at Edinburgh Air Force Base in South Australia and then Clarendon in Victoria, was posted here to Richmond. We have now moved outside of the base to the main Windsor to Richmond Road, which runs between the runway of the base and the railway line. Today, for an offence line, a United States Air Force C-141 Starlifter lands. Then we turn around and immediately observe a New South Wales Government Railways rail motor set going past. This picture is dated by the car, a 1969 XW model Ford Falcon. To the west of the base lies the Richmond Station and Township. This is at the end of the single track branch line from Richmond to Blacktown, connecting with Sydney bound trains. Sydney lies 65 kilometres to the east. These rail motors and trailers are classified CPH and CTH. More commonly, they are called the tin hares because of the roof-mounted radiators which look like rabbit's ears. The wavy black lines on each side of the picture is caused by my video editor's stabilisation function, as it attempts to keep the central picture steady. This is especially important as the original film stock is now over 50 years old and is deteriorated and stretched. From the Richmond Station yards, we relocate now to a point just west of the Clarendon Station, a little bit over 3 kilometres to the east, alongside of the Air Force runway. The Richmond Railway is a branch line running off the main Western Line originating at Blacktown. In the peak hours, the tin hares were supplemented by the more modern 620, 720 class rail cars. Here at Clarendon, Opposite direction trains approach each other on the single track line. There is no passing loop, just a stub-ended siding. The Blacktown bound train pulls into Clarendon and then reverses into the siding to wait for the Richmond bound train to pass, and then it runs forward again to resume its journey to Windsor and to Blacktown. Our journey to Perth in Christmas 1965 commenced with boarding our first train at Windsor Station, a 10 hare, for the journey to Blacktown. At Blacktown, we changed to our second train, a red rattler, coming from Penrith en route to Sydney on the main Western Line. Here, we take a break from our Perth-bound journey to have a look at trains on the main Western Line. We now take a trip out to Bathurst, a town 240 kilometres west by rail from Sydney. The year is about 1970 and the main standard gauge line through South Australia and Western Australia has now been opened. Our train has just passed over the Macquarie River Bridge. It is heritage listed but is no longer used by trains. We go out now on the main North Line. At Gosford, we see some steam still in service. Somewhere in New South Wales, we also found a South Australian Railways 830 class locomotive, a version of the New South Wales 48 class, shunting. This seems to be on loan from the South Australian Railways. We return to Sydney Central Station to join our third train. The standard gauge line into South Australia has not yet been commissioned, so we'll be catching the Spirit of Progress, a standard gauge Victorian train down to Melbourne. After an overnight run south on the Spirit of Progress, Dawn finds us stretching our legs at the Albury Station on the border of Victoria. Shortly after departing from Albury Station, we cross over the Murray River, passing into Victoria. In Melbourne, in the break before our next connection, we go out and have a look at an L-class electric locomotive in charge of the train. And then a Tate Red Rattler Suburban. Then we finish up with a blue and gold Harris Suburban train. Our next train, the fourth on our journey, is the Overland, running on the 5'3" broad gauge line between Melbourne and Adelaide in South Australia. On another day, at another time, we find this Overland train at Ballarat, travelling towards Melbourne. For the second time in 2 days, we cross over the Murray River, passing into South Australia. Our locos have just been changed, the Victorian railway units have been taken off, and the South Australian ones have taken over. This little town is called Murray Bridge. We paused at the station for a few minutes for a break. In Adelaide, the suburban railcars are called Red Hens. The country services are operated by railcars they call the Bluebirds. We spot some of these in the yards at the Adelaide station awaiting their next call to service. I had originally thought that our next train was unnamed. It travels the 230 kilometres from Adelaide to Port Pirie, but thanks to Leo, 1933, I now know that it's called the East-West Express. This will be the 5th train on our journey. At Port Pirie, the broad gauge trains pull in onto the south side platform. The north side is used by the standard gauge trains heading across the Nullarbor and to other points on the network. Here we see a bit of railway action. A Commonwealth Railways standard gauge train has arrived on the platform, while on the opposite platform the South Australian Railways broad gauge train is being prepared for a return trip. The standard gauge Commonwealth Railways train is shunted back into the yards for servicing, clearing the track for a Bud Rail diesel car to arrive to unload before it too is moved off to allow our own train to be put onto the platform for us to board. This venerable old brittle rail car in the yard has now been preserved by the Steam Ranger Heritage Railway. Here we'll board our sixth train, the Commonwealth Railways Trans train, crossing Nullarbor to reach Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. The following day sees us 822 kilometres west of Port Augusta. We've arrived at Cook, a settlement on the Transline built to service trains. Ah, the imagined joys of air-conditioned comfort as we crossed the hot Nullarbor plain. Alas, it was not to be so for me and my fellow soldiers, sailors and airmen. We were relegated to travelling in antique, non-air-conditioned carriages. At the time, I was less than impressed. Today, however, my story would be very different. How many people alive can say that they have crossed another Nullarbor in antique first-class twinette sleepers built in 1916. People would flock to the trackside festooned with cameras to photograph things like this. At Kalgoorlie we board our seventh train, the narrow gauge at Westland, for the run into Perth, before we board our eighth train, a Perth suburban service, for the run home.